Well, good morning, everyone. It's certainly an honor and a pleasure to be here, and thanks to Gall for organizing this whole event. So, no doubt we face a lot of challenges as a global society, but I'm going to assert to you that probably the number one challenge that we face is adequately feeding ourselves, and I think it's something that we've actually lost track of as time has moved on and policy focus has turned to a lot of other things. And so I want to redirect our attention to probably the number one issue facing a global society, which is adequately feeding our population at a reasonable cost. And in this realm, there's two types of people that we don't want to be. And one of my hypotheses is that people who've raised concerns over the centuries about feeding the population have been uniformly wrong, and famously so in many ways, to the point where I think it's people are reluctant to raise the issue again. So certainly the first person to do that was Thomas Malthus, and created a whole expression of to be Malthusian is to be a doomsayer. But there were others that came after him. Famously, a person who's still living and saying silly things today is Paul Ehrlich, and he was predicting that by 1985 we would have killed off enough people through starvation that there'd be 1.5 billion people on the planet. There were actually 4.9 billion at that point in time. Someone who came after him saying the next things, saying the same things, was somebody by the name of Lester Brown. So those people have been with us through the decades and the centuries, and they've all been wrong. And so we don't want to be that person, but I don't think we want to be this person either, right? And so I've given a version of this talk at a number of places in recent years, and I'm interested in the responses I get from the audience, and they'll point to an anecdote. They'll point to something like, oh, now they're developing robots to weed fields, or we can grow produce using vertical farming, and so we're going to be okay, right? I mean, we've got these things. And so they're blind faith believers in technology. And technology's out there, but as Gall said, productivity's slowing down based on the work of Alston and Party. So we don't want to be the doomsayers, but we don't want to be a blind faith believer that technology is always going to save us. And so what do we know about food demand growth moving forward? Well, we know some things, but not maybe as much as we might say. So the UN is predicting that there's going to be 36% more people on the planet in 2100. But I'm not a demographer and I don't follow this, but it's pretty stunning to me that there's that 10.9 right in the middle of this confidence band. But this is an 80% confidence band, so it's not even that confident. And there's a 28% gap as to how many people will be alive in the world in 2100. And then there is the fact that the fastest growing economies in the world now are the emerging economies, most notably China and India, where 36% of the world's population live. Those have income elastic demands, and so as the incomes grow, the demand for food is going to grow as well. Tom Hurdle is here today. Very important paper that he co-authors had in AAEA in 2016, where they looked at demand growth projections from the number of macro models that are out there. And again, dramatic how much they differ. A paper I want to draw attention to a little more recently, but Fukase and Martin in World Development break down the food demand growth. 1.72% a year they're predicting through 2050, but about 60% of it is an increase in per capita consumption coming from this. The other 40% is from population growth. So there's a lot of food demand growth built into the system as we move forward in time. And what we're doing now doesn't appear to be enough. I mean, first of all, according to the official UN data, there's inadequate diets for 1 out of 7 people in the world, food insecure diets for 1 out of 3. And if you look at these 4 basic staple commodities that comprise 2/3 of global agricultural calories, their yields have been increasing at rates that are less than the annual demand growth that's projected by Fukase and Martin. So we may not be on track as things stand. And what I'm going to assert to you then is that there are considerable headwinds to expanding food production, and in some sense we're sort of whistling past the graveyard, not worried too much about producing food, worried about ancillary things. And of course, the biggie there is climate change itself. And we could have a whole conference on climate change and its effects on agricultural production. I don't work in that area personally, I'm just a consumer of it. But here's just some basic results. Probably the leading researchers in this area are Wolfram Schlenker and Lobel. And you can see the dramatic yield declines that are being projected through time as a consequence of climate change. Now, I will surely tell you that this work is controversial. There's a lot more studies out there, but I'm not going to delve into that. But certainly, the leading scholars are forecasting relatively dramatic decreases in productivity due to climate change itself. Another issue is pest resistance. One of the developments, and probably a positive one on balance, but we've had to tailor chemicals, pesticides, herbicides, to be very specific in their uses, and as a consequence, pest resistance is easier. It's more prevalent for those types of commodities, or those types of products. And again, it's not an area where I work, but I can read the literature. You see what the article in Science says. This may be a little bit hard to read, but this is just a chronology through time of the different weeds that have become resistant to glyphosate. And so the ability to control pests is an issue. And then, as Gall already pointed out, ag productivity has been slowing down. Now, this, Alston and Party do it for the U.S. And they do it for the U.S. because that is the main place, as I understand it, where there's sufficient data to do this types of estimation. But you can see that from a historical average of 1.42, according to Alston and Party, we've dropped to about 1% since then. And so the blind faith believers in technology are the ones that are saying, yeah, we'll become more productive sufficiently to feed ourselves. Well, there's some evidence out there that our productivity is declining, and for probably good reasons that we could discuss, can and will discuss a little bit, a little further on in the presentation. And then I come to the point now where the policy comes in. We're doing a lot of things in this country and even globally to produce less food, not more. And I list some of the things there. There certainly is a strong movement afoot, and we know famous examples of this from Sri Lanka, Netherlands, that agriculture, even though agricultural productivity is going to be harmed by climate change, agricultural productivity is going to be harmed even more by draconian policies to force agriculture to be part of the solution to climate change. Something we take for granted today, but didn't exist when I came into the profession, is we're using a lot of our food supply not to produce food, but to produce biofuels, and that's baked into the system. We're spending less money in this country in particular, to fund agricultural research. My fourth point there is that we're supporting production of what we know as credence attributes products. And these are things like organic. A credence attribute is a product characteristic that we as consumers can't discern from searching or even consuming the product. We have to have it certified to us, whether it's organic, whether it's been produced with various animal welfare practices, and so forth. All of these credence attribute products are associated with lower productivity. Almost all of them are. And the most recent thing happening in this country, a product of COVID, is that we're going to have more resilient supply chains. And generally, at least for the present administration, that means localizing production and processing, doing it on a small scale. Most of the people in the room are economists. We all understand economies of scale. That will sacrifice economies of scale. And let me look a little more at each of these points. Climate smart agriculture. I mean, how much of global emissions are from agriculture? Well, you can see that the UN and the World Bank don't even agree on that. Their numbers differ quite a bit. And what exactly is climate smart agriculture? Well, I mean, I looked around on the internet a lot, and it's hard to figure out what people think it is, but one statement that really did catch my eye here was this one. And so we're managing crops not to optimize production or efficiency or profits, but to optimize reduction in emissions and adaptation to climate change. Now again, I'm not saying that's a bad thing, that we shouldn't be doing those types of things, but they will cause us to produce less food as a consequence. Biofuels. The most important crop in this country is corn. The biggest corn producer in the world is the US. And we use 35 to 40% of the corn crop to produce biofuels. Now, I'm guessing most of the people in the room know this, and that's just the way it is, right? Well, that's not the way it used to be. We didn't produce biofuels out of corn, and we're taking significant amounts of a food or a feedstock and using it to produce fuel. An expansion of that is built into the system. It's built into policies that are already in place, as you see from the slide. And here's a little bit on that ag productivity slowdown that Gall mentioned. If you can see from the chart here, we're moving through the decades, 50 to 70, 70 to 90, 90 to 2010, and then beyond 2010. This is from Alston and Party, and these are the growth rates in ag blue, public ag blue, public and private green, and then all R&D orange. And you can see the bars decreasing for ag research, both public and private, over time to where, in particular, we're, as a matter of policy, spending significantly less on agricultural research or in terms of growth rates as we move through each successive decade. And so from Alston and Party's perspective, that's the significant factor in their view that slowed down this ag productivity growth. And meanwhile, from the perspective of private ag R&D, declining in its growth rate and then declining absolutely in the most recent decades. And they suggest that it's due to a regulatory environment that deters private investments in ag R&D. And so, of course, this is policy, right? So that if we're making it harder and harder to innovate and get products on the market, to no surprise, we're getting less of it. And then mandates, subsidies for yield-reducing credence attributes. So it's happening in two ways, either banning things like GMOs or certain production practices for farm animals at national levels or at subnational levels. My home state, California, is certainly on the leading edge of doing things to impose animal welfare laws, not just on its own production, but on its consumption, right? And so most people probably know about our Proposition 12 that was upheld in the recent session of the U.S. Supreme Court, restricting the way animal product can be produced if they're going to be sold into California. And then there are policy goals in place to expand these things. The European Union wants to have 25% of its cropland inorganic by 2030. The U.S. doesn't have an express goal, but is subsidizing organic through many different policies. Japan's doing the same thing. So most of the Western world is engaging in these practices, and they're all associated with lower food production. Maybe the biggie is organic. Many studies across many crops and countries, and very consistent yield decrements, 20 to 25% on average across crops and countries. Those are largely based on test plots. If you look at actual commercial operations, the yield decrement is even more significant. It's on the order of about 35%. And there's controversy as to whether the gap will narrow or widen. Some people say it will narrow, learning by doing, better organic technologies. Other people say it will widen because the most efficient converters from conventional to organic will be the first. So as we pursue mandates to make more and more organic farmland, we're forcing less and less efficient converters to do so. And who buys organic? Well, maybe it's some of you in this room, but it is the wealthy. So every time we convert a hectare of ag land to organic and out of conventional, we make organic cheaper for the wealthy, conventional more expensive for the poor. Non-GMO. Again, I'm assuming most of the people know the story where it's GMOs are banned in much of Europe, much of Russia, most of sub-Saharan Africa. Very recent controversy with Mexico. And again, many meta-studies. Klumper and Martin Keim say that the GMOs are associated with a 22% yield increase, and it's most impactful in the developing countries. And it is being forestalled by policy. Animal welfare, just a couple of examples. My colleague Dan Sumner says cage-free eggs are 41 to 70% more expensive to produce. I have a very recent paper with a student of Dan's, Hanbin Lee, and we're suggesting that our Proposition 12 will raise hog production costs by about 7%. So it's not all that much, and primarily because there's already group housing in many parts of the U.S. that will then become compliant with California's law. But here's a little quiz for us. My home state has some of the most expensive housing in the country and perhaps the world. What is our most expensive housing investment? Well, a good guess would be San Francisco. Their annual rents are about $50 per square foot. So if you have a 1,000-foot apartment in San Francisco, you'd pay about $50,000 a year for it. Expensive to be sure, but it's not our most expensive investment. It's in fact sow housing in the U.S. Midwest. So Lee, Sumner, and myself did the math, and it turns out in terms of what we'll pay extra for pork products in California, we are paying $115 per square foot of housing per sow through Proposition 12. So that's the answer to that trivia question. It's actually sow housing in the Midwest that we're investing in substantially through Proposition 12. Resilience. That's a big thing these days, right? We want to be resilient. We don't want things like COVID and Proposition 12 to get to us. And what we've got there is then local processing is going to production and processing is going to sacrifice economies of scale. Not much study out there. The only one that I know of showed that if we were going to actually have a local production system, we would need to have 23% more land in agriculture in this country to support it due to the lower productivity. So if you only remember one number, really, when you think about it across organic, non-GMO, local, think about 25%, because that's what we're sacrificing in yield and productivity every time we pursue one of these strategies. And so what does it all imply? Reduced yields and productivity, and that then imposes a direct challenge to claims that are often made that these credence attribute products are beneficial to the environment, because it all comes back to intensive versus extensive expansion of production. Intensive is getting more off an existing land base. Extensive is expanding the land base, which is what we must do in order to feed ourselves if we're getting less off the existing land base. And then, Gall, I appreciated the point that you made that many of these policies are not readily reversible, so that if we are finding ourselves 20, 30 years down the road saying, oops, we shouldn't have done all these things that we did, let's undo them, that's not going to be easy to do for reasons that Gall indicated. So I want to give, as I'm closing here, kind of an opposing perspective. So this is from the UN FAO. They do one of these reports, I think, every year, and they're saying, well, how are we going to feed ourselves moving forward? And then maybe can we do some of these things that we know are going to reduce yields, but we want to do them anyway? Well, reduce conflicts. Great idea. Tell Vladimir Putin. Address climate change. Absolutely, we got to do it, but the climate is changing, and if agriculture is part of the answer, which it probably is, they're both going to reduce yields and productivity, and we should be taking that into account. Reduce food loss, food waste, yeah, that's a thing that's been talked about now for decades. And then the final one, and a big one, and potentially important, is to eat less animal products. So, policies that will expand food production, stop public support of yield-reducing credence attributes, and stop promoting legislation and regulations that reduce ag productivity and discourage innovation. Grow the public funding of agricultural research, and stop with these types of ideas. Their ability to make more resilience is in doubt anyway, and this surely will reduce productivity. And then to wrap it up, I signed a contract with the University of California Press to write a book on these topics, and so I will promote that book here and now. Finding exactly zero time to write it, but it's still, it's a contract now, and so that means I think I have to do it. And then the slide I'm going to leave up here as we hopefully have a bit of Q&A is some references to some scholarly works by myself and colleagues that provide support for some of the things that I've said to you here. So with that, I'm done, and thank you, and happy to address questions or comments.